Welcome to Bookfulness. This is episode 19 in our deep dive through the fundamentals of evolution. In our last deep dive, we were looking at geography, exploring where species are found across the planet.
Today, we're shifting focus quite dramatically. We're moving from geographical space to the immense sweep of geological time.
Yeah, much bigger canvas.
Definitely. We're tackling Chapter 19 of our source material, Fuchma and Kirkpatrick's Evolution, specifically the chapter titled The Evolution of Biological Diversity.
And we're trying to answer a really fundamental question, maybe the most fundamental. How has the total number of species, the sheer richness of life, actually changed over Earth's history?
Exactly. Our mission today is to unpack the dynamic forces that govern this grand narrative. Think of it as Earth's biological balance sheet.
Right, constantly being updated.
Constantly. It's always balancing two massive forces. The rate new species appear, which is speciation, and the rate old species disappear, extinction.
It's this interplay, this kind of constant tension between creation and loss that determines how much biological capital Earth has at any given moment.
So when we first start looking at species richness today, even just a quick glance shows something pretty staggering.
Which is?
That diversity isn't spread evenly across the tree of life at all. It's distributed in these incredibly uneven clumps.
Yeah, we tend to talk about biodiversity as this single big number, maybe, but the book really hammers home the huge contrast you see even between major groups like whole families or orders that are alive right now. Some groups are barely hanging on, others have just exploded.
Precisely. Let's start with plants. You've got the Ginkgoaceae family today, represented by just one single species, Ginkgo biloba.
The living fossil.
That's the one. A really long evolutionary history, all funneled down into this one survivor. It's quite amazing, really.
Okay, so hold that image. One family, one species.
Right.
Now contrast that with, say, the orchid family, Orchidaceae.
Ugh, the orchids. They're the complete opposite end of the spectrum, biologically speaking. An absolute explosion of diversity.
How many are we talking?
The Orchidaceae. Well, they boast over 18,000 described species, and probably many more waiting to be discovered.
18,000 versus 1. That contrast is, well, it's kind of mind-boggling. It forces you to ask, what allowed one group to diversify so massively while the other just didn't?
Exactly. What ecological or evolutionary factors were at play? And this isn't just plants. You see the same pattern everywhere.
Like in insects, which, as a group, are arguably the biggest success story on land.
Oh, definitely. You've got orders like the Embigoptera, the web spinners. Interesting group, sure, but relatively few species, maybe a few hundred globally.
Okay. And then...
Then you have the Coleoptera, the beetles.
Ah, yes. Haldane's famous quip about God's inordinate fondness for beetles.
Right, and the numbers absolutely back that up. They are, by a huge margin, the largest order of organisms we know of. Over 350,000 described species.
350,000. That just dwarfs almost everything else. It suggests they stumbled upon some kind of biological cheat code, didn't they?
It really does seem that way, and you see it in mammals, too. Think about the order Tubuligentata.
That's the aardvark, right?
Just the aardvark. One single living species, Oricterapus aforfer, totally unique creature, occupies its own branch, but evolutionarily speaking, it's quite lonely.
And then you compare it to its, well, not immediate sister group, but another mammal order like Rodentia.
Rodentia, yes. The rats, mice, squirrels, beavers, porcupines, over 2,280 species in that order.
So again, this massive disparity. Rodents clearly found ways to exploit ecological opportunities again and again all over the world.
These contrasts, and you can see them visualized nicely in Figure 19.1 in the source text if you have access to it. We'll put a link in the description there, our first big clue. Diversity isn't random. It's profoundly shaped by long-term evolutionary success or, well, failure.
And the key point here, I think, is that you just can't explain these huge differences by looking at today's world alone.
No, absolutely not.
To understand why there are, hundreds of thousands of beetles, and only when it's aardvark, you have to zoom out, way out, millions, hundreds of billions of years. You have to factor in climate change, continental drift, mass extinctions, bursts of speciation, everything. Hashtag tag 1.2.2. The basic model of diversity change.
Okay, so how do scientists actually try to model these huge long-term changes? There must be a basic framework.
There is. It relies on a core concept called diversification, which sounds fancy, but it's actually quite simple.
Go on.
Diversification, often symbolized as DLO dollar, is just the net rate of change in the number of species, which we call no dollars. And fundamentally, it's modeled as a balance between two rates.
Speciation and extinction.
Exactly. The rate of origination, or speciation, which we label ELOLers, and the rate of extinction, ELO dollar.
So the change in diversity L is just some minus of minuses off this S?
That's the basic equation. If speciation outpaces extinction, diversity goes up. If extinction wins, diversity goes down. Seems simple enough. But I guess the complexity comes in when you ask how those rates, same dollars, actually behave over long time scales. Do they stay constant? Do they change?
That's the critical question. And the source material contrasts two main models for how diversity might build up. The first one is, well, let's just say it's not very realistic. It's exponential growth.
Right, the runaway growth curve. Applied here, that would mean the diversification rate, deal your dollars, is constant or even increases.
It implies a constant per capita rate, meaning the total number of new species added per unit time keeps getting bigger as non-ala increases. Because, more species means more potential ancestors for new species.
Which sounds plausible for a moment, but
it assumes a world with basically unlimited resources, unlimited space, no ecological pushback, a world where the biological community never gets crowded.
And that's just not our planet, is it? It suggests diversity would just climb forever, steeper and steeper. We know there have to be limits.
Precisely. Which brings us to the much more plausible model, diversity-dependent growth. This usually results in what's called a logistic curve, or an S-shaped curve.
Logistic growth. This model assumes there's some kind of ecological limit,
Right.
right? A ceiling, often called the carrying capacity, or dollars.
Exactly. It's like filling up a room. At first, people walk in easily, lots of empty space. That's fast diversification early on.
Low dollar, high dollars.
Right. But as the room gets crowded, as dollar gets larger and approaches dollars, it gets harder to find a spot. The rate of people entering slows down.
So translating that to species, as diversity increases, the biological room gets full. Ecological niches get occupied.
And that puts the brakes on diversification. Either the speciation rate goes down because there are fewer unique opportunities for new species to exploit,
Or the extinction rate goes up because competition for those limited resources gets fiercer. Or maybe both happen.
Often it's a combination of both. The net result is that the diversification rate, SESE, slows down as non-dollar increases, eventually approaching zero when or if the system reaches that carrying capacity, dollars.
That makes a lot more sense ecologically.
It does. And the historical evidence, which we'll get into, suggests that while this global carrying capacity might have actually increased over Earth's history due to major evolutionary innovations, the process of diversification within a specific group or during a specific era often seems to follow this diversity-dependent logistic pattern. It slows down.
Okay, so this idea of limits, of carrying capacity, is really central. To figure out if life on Earth has actually bumped up against this global dollar at different times, we can't just speculate. We need the long-term data.
And that means turning to the only direct record we have of past life.
The fossil record.
Right. The fossil record is absolutely essential. It's the primary source paleontologists use to estimate those crucial origination and extinction rates for larger groups, like families or genera, across these vast geological timescales.
But using the fossil record, it sounds incredibly challenging. Isn't it famously incomplete? Like trying to read a book with most of the pages missing or damaged?
Oh, it absolutely is. And acknowledging the biases and the inherent difficulties in this data is step one. It's crucial.
So what are the main problems?
Well, firstly, the geologic record itself is patchy. Any one place on Earth only preserves a fraction of the history. Rock layers, the strata containing fossils, aren't laid down continuously everywhere. And once they are laid down, they're constantly being eroded away or fundamentally altered.
Altered how? You mentioned metamorphism earlier. What does that actually do to fossils?
Metamorphism involves intense heat and pressure, usually deep underground. If rocks containing fossils get subjected to that, the fossils can get distorted, crushed, recrystallized.
Basically destroyed or made unreadable.
Often, yes. The delicate structures or the chemical signatures just get obliterated. And this problem gets worse the further back in time you go.
Because older rocks have simply had more time to be buried deep, squeezed, heated up, or eroded away at the surface.
Exactly. So the older the geological period generally, the less well-preserved its fossil record is likely to be. This creates a huge bias. Paleontologists sometimes call it the pull of the recent.
Meaning that recent times look artificially diverse just because their record is better preserved?
Precisely. If you just naively counted the number of species found in, say, Cambrian rocks versus Cenozoic rocks, You'd drastically underestimate Cambrian diversity simply because so much more of its record has been lost over the intervening half-billion years.
So simple counts are out. How do researchers deal with this incomplete sampling?
They have to use some pretty sophisticated statistical methods. It's not just about counting fossils found, it's about estimating the probability that a particular group was actually present during a certain time interval, even if we haven't found its fossil in that specific interval.
Ah, so they're trying to infer the unseen parts of the record based on the fragments we do see.
In essence, yes. They model the probabilities of origination and extinction between time slices, accounting for the likelihood of finding fossils to get a more robust estimate of the true diversity dynamics. It's complex, but necessary. Hashtag tag 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 2.2 volatility and the turnover of taxa.
Okay, so once paleontologists apply these corrections and try to account for the biases, they can start looking for bigger patterns. And the source material highlights one really interesting pattern. Different groups show vastly different levels of volatility.
Volatility, yeah. In this context, it means the rate of turnover within a larger group, like an order. How quickly do families or genera within that order appear and then disappear over geological time?
So it's a measure of how evolutionarily dynamic or maybe even unstable a group is.
That's a good way to put it. High volatility means lots of speciation, but also lots of extinction, high turnover, constant churning.
And the really fascinating finding, mentioned in the text referencing figure 19.8, is that these rates, origination and extinction, seem to be correlated. They often go hand in hand.
That's a critical insight. High evolutionary birth rates often come with high death rates. For example, think about the trilobites.
Those iconic Paleozoic arthropods.
Right. They dominated the Paleozoic seas for hundreds of millions of years, but their fossil record shows they were highly volatile. Families within the trilobites were appearing and disappearing relatively rapidly.
High turnover.
Very high. Now, compare them to many grooms alive today, like, say, the gastropods marine snails. They tend to show much lower rates of both origination and extinction. They're less volatile.
So the trilobites were living life in the evolutionary fast lane, constantly innovating and replacing themselves, which maybe made them more vulnerable in the long run, while the snails are the slow and steady wins the race type.
That seems to be the pattern, and this correlation likely has a biological basis. Steve Stanley proposed years ago that certain characteristics of organisms could influence both high Cieselalers and high Zellers. A key factor often pointed to is ecological specialization.
That makes sense. If a species becomes highly specialized, say, it only eats one specific type of coral found only in shallow, warm waters.
It becomes incredibly vulnerable, right? A small change in temperature, sea level, or the arrival of a disease affecting that coral could wipe out the specialist species. So higher extinction risk.
But that same process of specializing, of adapting very tightly to a narrow, perhaps previously empty niche, could also be a powerful driver of speciation in the first place.
Exactly. Specialization can lead to reproductive isolation and the formation of new species. So you get this package deal. Specialization drives speciation, but also increases extinction risk. This leads to high turnover, high volatility.
So groups like the trilobites, with high volatility, were perhaps constantly making these high-risk, high-reward bets on specialization,
Yeah.
which ultimately made them more prone to large-scale failure when things went bad, like during mass extinction.
That's a very plausible interpretation of the pattern, yes.
Okay, we've got the tools, we understand the biases, and some basic dynamics like volatility. Now let's look at the grand picture. The actual history of marine animal diversity over the Phanerozoic eon, the last, 541 million years?
Right. And when you plot the estimated number of marine families or genera over that time, you get a curve often called Sepkoski's curve, after the paleontologist Jack Sepkoski, who did pioneering work compiling this data. Figure 19.4 in the text shows a version of this. It's a truly iconic graph in paleontology.
And it tells a dramatic story. It starts with a bang.
Right, it does. Following the Cambrian explosion, where most major animal body plans appeared relatively quickly, there's this initial burst of diversification. This really takes off in the Ordovician period, roughly 485 to 443 million years ago.
What was driving that early Ordovician increase? What was new?
A lot of ecological innovation. We see the first complex reef ecosystems being built by corals and sponges. These create intricate, three-dimensional habitats, opening up huge numbers of new niches compared to the simpler seafloor communities of the Cambrian.
So more ecological space, more diversity.
That seems to be the case. You get this massive diversification of many invertebrate groups. Brachiopods, crinoids, cephalopods, trilobites were still going strong. It established a much higher level of diversity than seen before.
But after that initial surge, the curve seems to flatten out for a long time into what the text calls the Paleozoic plateau.
That's right. For almost 300 million years, through the rest of the Paleozoic era, the overall diversity of marine families remained remarkably stable, albeit at that higher level achieved in the Ordovician.
It wasn't static, though, right? Species in general were still originating and going extinct within that plateau.
Oh, absolutely. There was constant turnover, the volatility we talked about,
Hmm.
but the net number of families stayed roughly the same. It was a dynamic equilibrium maintained by the dominance of characteristic Paleozoic groups, the trilobites we mentioned, plus brachiopods, the lampshells, crinoids, sea lilies, and certain types of corals. They had sort of filled up the available ecological megaspace of the Paleozoic seas.
But this long period of stability, this plateau,
Mhm.
was violently interrupted
Okay.
multiple times by mass extinctions.
Yes. These are the points where extinction, massively and relatively suddenly, overwhelms speciation on a global scale.
And it's important to remember the difference. This isn't the slow, steady background extinction happening all the time. Mass extinctions are short, catastrophic events.
Exactly. They are characterized by exceptionally high extinction rates, way above the background, affecting a broad range of unrelated organisms across different environments, all happening in a geological blink of an eye.
The book highlights the big 5 major mass extinctions that really reshaped the history of life.
They are the major punctuation marks in the story. The first big one was the end Ordovician extinction, around 443 million years ago. In terms of the percentage of genera or families lost, it might actually be the second largest of all time.
What caused that one?
The leading hypothesis is a major episode of global cooling, leading to large-scale glaciation, probably centered around the South Pole, which Gondwana was drifting over at the time. This would have caused sea levels to drop dramatically and rapidly, devastating the shallow marine ecosystems where most life was concentrated.
Okay. Then came the late Devonian extinction. This one seems a bit more complex, maybe multiple events.
Yes, it was more protracted, possibly spanning several million years, with several pulses of extinction. The causes are still debated, maybe anoxia in the oceans, maybe volcanism, maybe climate change, but it hit tropical reef communities particularly hard.
And then, the big one, the end Permian extinction, the Great Dying.
252 million years ago. This event defines the boundary between the Paleozoic era and the Mesozoic era, and for good reason. It was, by far, the most devastating extinction event in Earth's history.
The numbers are just staggering.
Estimates suggest something like 96% of all marine species went extinct, and over 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. It came incredibly close to sterilizing the planet. It fundamentally reset the biosphere, wiping out the dominant Paleozoic fauna like trilobites and many brachiopods and corals.
It's hard to even comprehend. Life today is descended from that tiny fraction, maybe 4% of marine species that somehow survived.
It really is. After the Permian, the fourth major event was the end Triassic extinction, about 201 million years ago. This one significantly impacted both marine and terrestrial life, and importantly, it seems to have cleared the way for the dinosaurs to rise to dominance in the Jurassic.
And finally, the most famous one, the end Cretaceous extinction, or the KPG boundary event, 66 million years ago.
The dinosaur killer, caused primarily by the impact of a massive asteroid or comet in the Yucatan Peninsula region. This wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs, pterosaurs, large marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, and crucial marine invertebrates like the ammonoids.
And that event, of course, marks the end of the Mesozoic and the beginning of our current era, the Cenozoic. The age of mammals began because the dinosaurs were gone.
In large part, yes. The extinction of the dominant dinosaurs opened up ecological opportunities that mammals and birds were able to exploit and radiate into.
Looking at the curve after these extinctions, particularly after the Permian and Cretaceous events, what's the pattern?
Recovery is often slow at first, but then diversity tends to rebound, often exceeding previous levels. The Mesozoic era, despite the end Triassic bump, saw the diversification of dinosaurs on land, the rise of modern gymnosperms and then angiosperms, flowering plants, and the early diversification of mammals, birds, and teleost fishes.
And the Cenozoic, the last 66 million years.
The Cenozoic shows a really striking pattern, a steady, almost continuous, and quite pronounced increase in overall marine diversity and terrestrial diversity, too. This is driven by the massive radiation of the modern groups mammals, birds, snakes, teleost fishes, flowering plants, many insect groups. This overall rise happened despite major climate swings, including ice ages. Hashtag 3.3, the three evolutionary tiers.
Okay, so we have this complex history, an early rise, a long plateau, devastating crashes, and then a long, steady rise through the Mesozoic and Cenozoic. It's a lot to take in.
It is. And the paleontologist Richard Bambach proposed a useful way to conceptualize this long-term pattern, particularly for marine life. He suggested thinking about it in terms of three successive evolutionary faunas or tiers that dominated the seas sequentially.
So it's not just about the total number of species, but about which groups were the major players at different times.
Exactly. It highlights the replacement aspect of macroevolution. The first tier was a Cambrian fauna.
The earliest groups after the explosion.
Right, things like trilobites, though they persisted much longer, primitive mollusks, weird critters like Wawaxia, often relatively simple deposit feeders or grazers dominating those early seafloor ecosystems.
Then came the Paleozoic fauna.
This group dominated throughout that long Paleozoic plateau. It includes the more advanced trilobites, the articulate brachiopods, crinoids, rugose, and tabulate corals. These groups really defined marine life for hundreds of millions of years.
Until the end Permian crash wiped most of them out.
Devastated them, yes. And rising from those ashes and really taking over through the Mesozoic and especially the Cenozoic is the modern fauna.
Which includes?
This includes the groups that dominate today's oceans. Mollusks like gastropods, snails, and bivalves, clams, teleost fishes, decapod crustaceans, crabs and shrimp, echinoids, sea urchins, scleractinian corals, modern reef builders.
So the big insight from Bambach's model is that the history of diversity isn't just a story of accumulation. It's a story of replacement.
Yes, one ecological dynasty replaces another. This suggests that the increase in diversity isn't necessarily life just finding more and more ways to exist in a vacuum, but often involves competition and displacement or maybe opportunistic replacement after extinctions clear the board.
Let's circle back to extinction for a moment because it's clearly a huge part of this story.
Mm.
We've talked about the difference between the rare, catastrophic mass extinctions and the ongoing, lower-level background extinction.
Right. And while mass extinctions are incredibly dramatic and reshape the biosphere quickly, it's actually the slow, relentless grind of background extinction that accounts for the majority of species loss over the grand sweep of geological time.
That's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? You'd think the big crashes would be the main cause of loss.
They cause huge drops in diversity, absolutely. But background extinction is always happening. Every million years, some fraction of the existing species silently disappears. Cumulatively, over hundreds of millions of years, that adds up to a vast number of extinctions.
And when paleontologists try to measure this background rate for different groups, like genera or families, they find something really surprising, right, about its consistency.
Yes, this is one of the most profound findings, often associated with Lee Van Valen's work back in the 70s. When you look at the duration of fossil genera or families, how long they persist in the record before disappearing, you often find that their probability of going extinct in any given interval of time seems to be roughly constant, regardless of how long they've already existed.
Wait, say that again. It doesn't matter if a family is young or old. Its chance of dying out in the next million years is about the same.
That's what the data often suggests, yes. A family that's been around for 50 million years doesn't seem inherently safer or less likely to go extinct than one that originated only 5 million years ago.
But that flies in the face of basic evolutionary thinking, doesn't it? Isn't evolution supposed to make lineages better adapted, fitter, more robust over time? Shouldn't older lineages have proven themselves and be less likely to go extinct?
You'd think so. If adaptation accumulated and provided ever-increasing security, we'd expect extinction risk to decrease with lineage age. The fact that it often appears constant suggests something else is going on. It suggests that adaptation might not buy you long-term security in the way we intuitively assume.
So what's the explanation? Why the constant risk?
This is where the Red Queen hypothesis comes in. Hashtag 4.2 constant risk and coevolutionary pressure.
The Red Queen, from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place.
Exactly. Van Valen proposed this hypothesis to explain the constant extinction probability. The idea is that lineages aren't just adapting to a static physical environment, they are primarily adapting to a constantly changing biotic environment.
Meaning they're evolving in response to their competitors, predators, parasites, diseases, all of which are also evolving.
Precisely. It's a coevolutionary arms race. Your predators are getting better at hunting you, so you have to get better at escaping. Your competitors are getting better at finding food, so you have to get better too, or find something else. Your parasites are evolving ways around your defenses, so you need new defenses.
So even if the climate stays perfectly stable for millions of years, a species still has to keep evolving, keep running, just to maintain its relative fitness compared to everything else around it that's also running.
That's the core idea. You have to constantly adapt just to avoid falling behind and being outcompeted or overwhelmed. Adaptation isn't necessarily progress towards some ultimate state of perfection. It's often just keeping pace in this relentless biological race.
And if you stop running or can't adapt fast enough,
Your relative fitness declines and your extinction risk goes up. The constant probability of extinction reflects this constant, inescapable pressure from the co-evolving biotic world.
oh wow. That paints a picture of evolution as a much more dynamic and maybe precarious process than just slow, steady improvement. It means extinction is fundamentally tied to this failure to keep pace.
It does. It frames background extinction not just as random bad luck or failure to cope with physical change, but as an inherent consequence of interacting in a biologically dynamic world.
Okay, so extinction, driven by this Red Queen dynamic, is this powerful, ever-present force trying to push diversity down. Now we really need to understand the forces pushing back. What allows diversity to not just persist, but to actually increase overall despite this constant pressure?
Right. So what fuels the other side of the equation, the speciation side, sometimes leading to big increases in diversity? One major factor is the availability of ecological opportunity.
Which basically means empty niches, open jobs in the ecosystem.
Essentially, yes. It's the availability of resources and ecological roles that are currently underutilized or not utilized at all by competing species. This often happens in new environments like islands or after mass extinctions clear out incumbents.
And when a lineage encounters this kind of open landscape, it can lead to adaptive radiation.
Exactly. Adaptive radiation is when a single ancestral lineage diversifies relatively rapidly into many different species, each adapted to exploit a different part, the newly available ecological space.
And the classic textbook example of this has to be the Hawaiian honeycreepers, right?
Right.
Mentioned in the text with figure 19.11.
Oh, absolutely spectacular case. A single ancestral species, probably some kind of Asian rosefinch, colonized the remote Hawaiian archipelago millions of years ago.
And what did it find there?
It found, while not much competition, especially from other songbirds, Hawaii is incredibly isolated, so niches that on continents would be filled by finches, warblers, woodpeckers, sunbirds, they were largely empty.
A blank slate, ecologically speaking.
Pretty much. And the descendants of that original colonist radiated explosively to fill those vacant roles. They evolved into about 60 different species, sadly. Only 18 survive today due to human impacts, but they developed an incredible array of beak shapes and feeding habits.
Like what?
You got species with thick, finch-like bills for crushing seeds, others with long, curved bills for sipping nectar, perfectly matched to specific Hawaiian flowers. Some evolved thin, warbler-like bills for catching insects, and some even evolved stronger, straighter bills to probe bark and wood for grubs, acting like woodpeckers.
It's an amazing showcase of evolution's power when competition is removed. The sheer speed and diversity generated from one ancestor is incredible.
It really highlights how potent ecological opportunity can be as a driver for rapid speciation and diversification. Hashtag 5.2, the power of key adaptations.
Okay, so external opportunity is one driver.
Yeah.
But diversification can also be kicked off by changes within the lineage itself, right?
Mhm.
Through the evolution of what are called key adaptations.
Yes, exactly. A key adaptation isn't about the environment being empty, it's about the organism evolving some new feature, a new structure, a new physiological trick, a new behavior that fundamentally changes how it interacts with the world.
And this new feature allows it to do something radically new. Access new resources, maybe? Or just outcompete others in a new way.
Right, it unlocks a new way of life, a new adaptive zone. This can significantly boost the speciation rate by opening up new niche possibilities, or it might lower the extinction rate by making the lineage more resilient or competitive. Either way, it drives up net diversification.
And insects provide some classic examples here too, don't they?
They really do. Insect evolution seems to have had at least two major accelerations linked to key adaptations. The first, way back, was the evolution of wings.
Flight. Obvious advantage for dispersal, finding food, escaping predators.
Huge advantage. But perhaps an even more impactful innovation later on was the evolution of complete metamorphosis.
The four-stage life cycle. Egg, larva, pupa, adult. Like a butterfly or a beetle. Why was that such a big deal for diversity? It seems more complicated.
It seems complicated, but it's incredibly efficient because it decouples the major life tasks. Think
Ah,
about it. The larva, like a caterpillar or a grub, is essentially a specialized eating and growing machine. That's its main job.
okay.
The butterfly or beetle is primarily a specialized dispersal and reproduction machine. Often, adults feed very differently from larvae, like nectar versus leaves, or sometimes hardly feed at all.
Ah, so the larva focuses on accumulating resources, and the adult focuses on spreading genes.
Yeah.
And they don't compete with each other for food because they often live in different places or eat different things.
Exactly. This separation of ecological roles between life stages reduces conflict within the species and allows each stage to become highly specialized for its task without compromising the other stage. This innovation is thought to be a major reason why the four insect orders with complete metamorphosis beetles, flies, wasp species, and moths, butterflies are so incredibly species rich. They contain the vast majority of all insect species.
That's fascinating. So a change in life cycle strategy became a key adaptation driving massive diversification. Do we see similar things in marine life? The book mentions echinoderms.
Yes, sea urchins and their relatives. They also show bursts of diversification linked to key adaptations, particularly in feeding and lifestyle. For instance, some regular sea urchins, order Echinacea, evolved more powerful jaws and scraping apparatus, Aristotle's lantern, which allowed them to graze more effectively on a wider variety of algae and encrusting organisms.
Expanding their menu.
Right.
Yeah.
And perhaps even more dramatically, the irregular echinoids, the heart urchins and sand dollars, evolved a very different flattened body shape, along with modified spines and tube feet.
What did that allow them to do?
It allowed them to become highly specialized burrowers in soft sediment. Instead of scraping surfaces, they could move through sand or mud, ingesting sediment and extracting organic particles. This opened up a vast new adaptive zone on and within the seafloor, which was previously less accessible to their ancestors.
And their diversity took off as a result.
Dramatically so, especially during the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras. That shift to burrowing, enabled by those morphological key adaptations, fueled a major radiation. Hashtag 5.3 herbivory and coevolutionary diversification.
Now, when scientists identify something like burrowing or metamorphosis and call it a key adaptation, how do they actually test that? How do they show the trait itself caused the increase in diversity and it wasn't just, luck or that group being older?
That's a critical question. You need to control for evolutionary history. The best method currently used is called replicated sister group comparison.
Okay, break that down. Replicated sister group comparison.
You start with a reliable phylogenetic tree, a map of evolutionary relationships. You identify a trait you hypothesize is a key adaptation, let's say herbivory, the ability to eat plants. Then you find cases on the tree where this trait evolved independently.
So multiple separate origins of plant eating in different insect groups, for example.
Exactly. For each origin, you find the lineage that has the trait, the herbivorous clade, and compare its species richness, how many species it contains, to the richness of its closest relative on the tree, its sister group, which lacks the trait, for example, is predatory or eats decaying matter.
Ah, I see. The sister group is the closest possible comparison, sharing the same amount of evolutionary time since they split from their common ancestor. So, any consistent difference in species numbers between the herbivore group and its non-herbivore sister is likely due to the herbivory itself.
Precisely. It controls for time and isolates the effect of the trait. And you need to do this across multiple independent origins. That's the replicated part to make sure the pattern is general and not just a fluke in one or two cases.
So what did this method show for insect herbivory? Is it a key adaptation?
The evidence is very strong. Herbivory has evolved many times in insects. At least 50 independent origins are known. A key study looked at 13 well-documented cases with good phylogenies.
And the result?
In 11 out of those 13 comparisons, the herbivorous lineage contains significantly more species than its non-herbivorous sister lineage.
Wow, 11 out of 13. That's pretty convincing evidence.
It really is. It strongly supports the idea that shifting to a plant-based diet has been a major driver of insect diversification, probably because it opens up a huge resource base, plants are everywhere, and potentially locks insects into coevolutionary arms races with plant defenses, driving further specialization and speciation. Figure 19.13 illustrates this concept.
And this coevolutionary dynamic can drive diversity in plants too, right?
Yeah.
The book mentions columbines.
Yes, the genus Aquilegia, the columbines. They're famous for their beautiful, complex flowers with these long, backward-pointing nectar spurs.
Which different pollinators access, like hummingbirds or long-tongued moths.
Exactly. The length and shape of these spurs often co-evolve very tightly with the beak length or tongue length of their specific pollinators. This specialization acts as a form of reproductive isolation. A flower might only be effectively pollinated by one type of animal, and studies have shown that the evolution of these spurs and changes in spur length are strongly correlated with higher rates of speciation within Aquilegia. It's pollinator-driven diversification visualized in figure 19.15.
So specialization driven by interaction is key. And the last example mentioned involves the incredibly diverse cichlid fishes in Africa's Rift Valley lakes. Their diversification seems to be a mix of factors.
It really does. Ecological opportunity clearly played a role. These large lakes offered diverse habitats, depths, and food sources. But their truly explosive speciation also seems heavily driven by sexual selection, acting on traits used in meat choice.
Like their bright colors.
Yes, many species show strong sexual dichromatism. Males are brightly colored, females are drabber. Female preference for specific male color patterns can evolve very rapidly and differs between populations, leading to quick reproductive isolation.
And the book also mentions egg dummies. What are those?
Ah, yes. In many mouth-brooding cichlids, the males have these bright egg-like spots called egg dummies, or egg spots, on their anal fins. When they court a female, she snaps at these spots, thinking they are eggs she dropped. As she does, the male releases sperm, fertilizing the real eggs she's already picked up into her mouth.
Wow, that's intricate.
It is. And subtle variations in the appearance or number of these egg spots are also under strong female mate choice. So, like color patterns, they can evolve rapidly and contribute to the incredibly fast speciation rates seen in these fish. It's a combination of ecology and sexual selection acting as powerful engines of diversification.
Okay, we've seen these powerful forces, opportunity and adaptation, driving diversity up. But let's come back to that idea of limits we discussed earlier. Does diversity actually hit a ceiling? Does it reach an equilibrium or carrying capacity, like that logistic model suggests?
That's a huge question in macroevolution, and the answer is, well, it seems complicated, but there's definitely evidence suggesting that diversification often does slow down as diversity increases within a particular group or region.
So, evidence for diversity dependence.
Yes, especially from studies using molecular phylogenies, evolutionary trees based on DNA. A key tool here is the lineage through time LTT plot.
Right. How do those work again?
Researchers take a group of related living species, say a genus or family. They sequence DNA from many of them and use the differences in the DNA sequences, calibrated with a molecular clock, estimated mutation rates, to reconstruct the evolutionary tree and estimate when each branching point, each speciation event occurred in the past.
So you get a timeline of how lineage is accumulated within that group. And
Exactly. The LTT plot graphs the number of lineages, species, existing within that clade against time, usually from the origin of the clade in the past up to the present.
what pattern on that plot suggests a slowdown?
If diversification were constant per lineage, exponential growth, the line on a logarithmic scale would go straight up. But what researchers often find, for example, in the LTT plot for Setophaga wood warblers shown in figure 19.17, is that the curve tends to flatten out or become less steep as it approaches the present day.
Meaning the rate at which new lineages were being added slowed down more recently compared to earlier in the group's history.
Precisely. The interpretation is often that the initial radiation was rapid when the group first evolved and niches were relatively open. But as the clade diversified and ecological space filled up with its own members, the net rate of diversification decreased. Fewer opportunities remained, maybe competition increased.
So the LTT plots provide one line of evidence for slowdowns. Is this backed up by the fossil record too?
Yes, studies looking at the origination and extinction rates of marine invertebrate genera or families through the Phanerozoic also find patterns consistent with diversity dependence.
How so?
They often find that the origination rate in a given time interval is negatively correlated with the diversity dollar at the start of that interval, meaning when diversity was already high, fewer new groups tended to appear.
And extinction rates.
Conversely, extinction rates sometimes show a positive correlation with starting diversity. When diversity was high, extinction rates tended to be higher in the following interval, perhaps due to increased competition.
So both sides of the DDSE equation seem to respond to existing diversity levels. High diversity tends to slow down S and speed up E, pushing the system back towards some equilibrium.
That's the interpretation, yes. It suggests that ecological limits are real and diversity is regulated, at least within certain ecological or taxonomic frameworks. Lineages seem to approach a carrying capacity, and then they struggle to push much beyond it without some major change. Hashtag 6.2, the mechanisms of limitation and replacement.
Okay, so if diversity often hits these limits, how do we explain the grand pattern of replacement we talked about earlier, like the modern fauna replacing the Paleozoic fauna? If the world was full under the Paleozoic fauna, how did the modern fauna take over? One group must push the other out or wait for an opening, right?
Exactly. This leads to distinguishing between two main ways that replacement might happen when diversity is limited. The source material illustrates these as competitive displacement versus incumbent replacement.
Okay, let's take competitive displacement first. What does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Figure 19.0a in the text.
This is the active scenario. You have two competing groups, Clade 1 and Clade 2. Clade 2 is intrinsically competitively superior. Maybe it's more efficient at getting food or better defended. As Clade 2 diversifies and increases in abundance, it actively outcompetes Clade 1 for shared resources, driving down Clade 1's diversity and eventually leading to its decline or extinction.
So the winner actively pushes the loser out. Direct competition is the driver.
Yes. Now compare that to incumbent replacement, figure 19.20.
This one sounds more passive.
It is. In this scenario, you have Clade 1, the incumbent, already occupying the available ecological space. Clade 2 might arrive later, and it might even be potentially superior, but it can't diversify because the niches are already full. It's held back simply by the presence of the incumbent.
So it's waiting in the wings.
Right. Then, some external factor, maybe a mass extinction or a climate shift that disproportionately harms Clade 1, wipes out or severely reduces the incumbent. Then Clade 2, which might have survived the event better or just finds the newly vacated space, can rapidly radiate and take over.
So the key difference is why the replacement happens. In displacement, it's the winner's superior competitive ability. In incumbent replacement, it's the loser's vulnerability to some external factor which creates an opportunity for the winner.
Precisely. Was the change driven by direct interaction or by differential response to an environmental perturbation?
Can we actually tell which mechanism was at play using the fossil record? The book gives the example of bryozoans.
Yes, the bryozoans, tiny colonial filter-feeding animals that often encrust shells or rocks, provide a really nice case study. There are two main groups, the cyclostomes, which are an older lineage, and the chylostomes, which appeared later in the Mesozoic.
And how do they interact?
Direct observations show that chylostomes are generally competitively superior. When colonies of the two groups meet and try to grow over the same space, chylostomes usually win. They overgrow the cyclostomes.
Okay, so chylostomes are the better competitors. What does their diversity history look like?
Chylostomes appeared in the late Jurassic and diversified steadily, really taking off in the Cretaceous and Cenozoic. Cyclostomes, the older group, were doing okay, but their diversity took a big hit at the end Cretaceous extinction, the dinosaur killer. And unlike the tylostomes, they never really recovered their former diversity levels in the Cenozoic. Their diversity actually declined.
So did the rise of the competitively superior chylostomes prevent the cyclostomes from recovering after the extinction?
That's what researchers wanted to test. They used mathematical models, fitting them to the detailed fossil diversity data for both groups across the Cretaceous-Cenozoic boundary.
And a result.
The models strongly suggested that the post-extinction diversification of the chylostomes actively inhibited the recovery of the cyclostomes. The best fit was to the competitive displacement model. It wasn't just that cyclostomes suffered the extinction badly, their recovery was actively suppressed by the burgeoning, competitively superior chylostomes taking over the available space.
Fascinating. So competition can be a powerful force shaping diversity, even across mass extinction boundaries.
It certainly seems so in this case.
But even with these limits in competition, the overall trend for global diversity, especially in the Cenozoic, has been upwards. So something must be allowing life to occasionally break through these ceilings.
Absolutely. While limits seem real within existing ecological frameworks, evolution keeps finding ways to change the rules. Key adaptations can open up entirely new ways of making a living, effectively raising the carrying capacity. Think about flight or photosynthesis or multicellularity itself.
Game changers.
Huge game changers. And also, major geological and environmental events play a role. The breakup of continents creates geographic isolation, driving speciation. The formation of mountain ranges or changes in ocean currents creates new climates and habitats. These large-scale physical changes constantly reshuffle the ecological deck, creating new opportunities and allowing diversity to continue its overall, albeit punctuated, climb throughout Earth's history. The ceiling might be real at any given moment, but evolution and geology keep adding new floors to the building. Hashtag outro.
Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive into the evolution of biological diversity. We've journeyed across hundreds of millions of years looking at the grand patterns of life's expansion and contraction.
We really have. We started by grasping the sheer scale and unevenness of diversity, then looked at the basic model, diversification as the outcome of speciation minus extinction, $ equals SEE.
We saw how difficult but crucial it is to read the fossil record, accounting for its biases, and how concepts like volatility and the correlation between speciation and extinction emerge from that record.
Then we trace the history through the Phanerozoic, a Cambrian explosion, the Ordovician radiation, the long Paleozoic plateau, the devastating punctuation marks of the big five mass extinctions, and the remarkable rise of the modern fauna in the Mesozoic and Cenozoic.
We explored the relentless pressure of background extinction, possibly driven by the Red Queen dynamic of coevolutionary arms races.
And countered that with the drivers of diversification. That the power of ecological opportunity, seen so clearly in adaptive radiations like the Hawaiian honeycreepers, and the role of key adaptations like insect metamorphosis or specialized feeding structures in unlocking new evolutionary pathways.
We also saw evidence that diversification often slows down as limits are approached, suggesting diversity dependence is real. And look at how replacement happens through competitive displacement or incumbent replacement.
Yeah, the core takeaway really is that biological diversity is this incredibly dynamic process. It's a constant balancing act. The ever-present threat of extinction, both background and mass, is countered by these bursts of speciation, fueled by opportunity and innovation. And while it seems regulated by ecological limits, those limits themselves have been repeatedly raised over geological time.
So thinking about all this, here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. We learned that ecological specialization, while a potent driver of speciation, often makes lineages more volatile, more prone to both originating and going extinct. What might this imply for the future stability of today's highly diverse, often highly specialized ecosystems, especially given the rapid, human-driven environmental changes we're currently experiencing? Are the very processes that generated today's richness potentially making it more fragile in the face of unprecedented change?
That's a really critical and frankly worrying question that builds directly on these long-term evolutionary principles. It's something to keep in mind. Next time, though, we're going to shift gears slightly. We'll take all these concepts, speciation, extinction, adaptation, diversity dynamics, and synthesize them to tackle the really big picture of macroevolution. How do major new forms of life, new body plans actually originate?
Sounds fascinating. We hope you'll join us for that. Thanks for learning with us on this deep dive.
Join us for the next bookfulness.